everybody, how's it going? It's Mr. White here with your first world history video test review. Now, you're going to need to have out your test review paper that you got in class, and you probably also want to have out a piece of regular notebook paper so that you can write down some of this information as we go over it. Remember that your test review is just a list of concepts. You need to know information about each of those concepts if you want to be successful in the test, which is coming up on Wednesday, September the 9th. So, what I suggest is as I go over these concepts, you should try to write them down. I'll even throw some words up on the screen, so if you need to, you can pause the video, write down the words, and then we'll go on to the next concept. Okay? So, if you need to download the test review paper, it's available at my website. Just check this little web address right here. And without further ado, let's just get right into the test review. So, the first thing it talks about is hunting and gathering. And I think that's a pretty easy concept for most of us, because it is exactly what it sounds like. You know, in the old days, people had to hunt for their food, and they had to gather whatever kind of food was available in their environment. Now, this didn't provide very much food for the people. So in order for them to have enough food, every single person in the society was needed for collecting food. That didn't leave any time for people to do other things, like have jobs besides being a hunter-gatherer. During this time period, people didn't have permanent homes. They moved around from place to place. We call that nomad or nomadic. From time to time, people would take refuge in caves, and that's why sometimes we refer to these people as cavemen. Now, we know a lot about the way these cavemen lived, not only from the tools they left behind, but even from some of the paintings that they painted on the walls of the caves that they lived in from time to time. Like, check out this example. You see, back then, people depended on indigenous animal species for survival. Indigenous is just a fancy word that means native to the place where you live. So, as these indigenous animals moved around, the people had to move around too. Otherwise, they just wouldn't have any food to eat. Eventually, people living in an area called the Fertile Crescent began to realize that they could control their own food supply by planting crops and domesticating animals. This is the beginning of a time period that we call the Neolithic Revolution. So hopefully that's sounding kind of familiar to you. You know, that's some of the most important stuff that you ought to know about hunter-gatherers. Now, something that goes along with hunter-gatherers is the next bullet point on our test review, the out of Africa theory. Because of the fact that humans were hunter-gatherers, remember I said we were nomadic, we moved around, we followed our food sources. Well, as animal species migrated out of Africa following the last ice age, that was approximately 100,000 BC, people had to follow those animal herds, and eventually they followed those animal herds to other parts of the world, like the Middle East, Europe, East Asia, and even eventually as far away as places like North and South America. Now, humans followed their food sources, and that was the main cause for people to leave Africa. And eventually, they spread human culture and human civilization all over the world, because when farming came around, that changed everything. Okay, now the next thing it asks about is the Neolithic Revolution, and that goes right along with farming. So the Neolithic Revolution was that time period between 8000 BC and about 1500 BC. That was the time period when humans changed their method of food production. It was a big shift from gathering food to producing food. That's really what you ought to know about the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution eventually led to what we call a food surplus. Surplus means having more of something than you actually need. And this was something that allowed people to begin to specialize in other kinds of jobs. Because since we had a food surplus, not everybody was needed to produce food anymore. So now people could have other jobs like being an artisan or a merchant or a priest or a scribe. All those new jobs opened up during the Neolithic Revolution. All right, let me move on here in my notes. Let's see what else we got. Something else that you ought to know about the Neolithic Revolution is that there was a huge growth in population worldwide. Remember we said there was more food. And something that we see all throughout history is anytime there's more food, we end up having more people. So population growth is a big part of the Neolithic Revolution. You may also remember that people developed new tools and new technologies to make their lives easier. And humans also began to domesticate animals during this time period. In case you forgot what domesticate means, that means controlling the growth and reproduction of animals and having them serve human needs. Like, for example, having dogs as pets or to help you hunt, or having cows and pigs and goats and sheep as a food source. That's domestication. Now, most of these changes that happened during the Neolithic Revolution were very good for people, but there were some things that were kind of negative, things that actually had a bad effect on the planet. Like, for example, early farmers were not very environmentally friendly in the way they did things. Many of them practiced something called slash and burn agriculture, where you basically cut down all the trees in an area and burn them, which enriches the soil for a while, but then eventually the soil loses most of its nutrients and you can't farm there anymore. This led to massive deforestation, and actually a lot of the world's forests were lost forever because people weren't very careful about how they were farming in those early days. Now, eventually, farming, which began in the Fertile Crescent, began to spread all over the world, and before long, all of the people of the world were practicing farming as a way to have settled civilizations. Okay, so next up, agriculture. What is agriculture and what does it look like? Well, agriculture is just a fancy way of saying farming. Hopefully you remember that. Agriculture equals farming. Now, some words that go along with agriculture are like domestication. You know, sometimes we say that when we adapted plants for human use that we domesticated the plants. We also domesticated animals at this time. Horticulture is another word that you ought to know. Horticulture is just a fancy way of saying people gardening or growing their own food. And another word that goes along with that is cultivation. Cultivation is yet another word meaning when people grow food. Okay? Now, at first, all this farming and cultivation appeared to guarantee a much larger food supply. But eventually, people realized that there were some problems. Like, for example, when you have a large population, it can lead to things like crime and war. Having domesticated animals can lead to diseases, and depending too much on crops can sometimes lead to famine if your crops fail. Also, remember I said that some of their farming practices were not very good for the environment, and so there was a whole lot of environmental damage that happened at this time. So, that's what you should know about agriculture. Next up is the impact of an agricultural surplus. Now, you might remember I said that surplus means having more of something than you actually need. So once we started having more food than we actually needed, that led to having more people. So one of the effects of agricultural surplus is population growth. Another thing that happened is as we got more and more people and we didn't need all those people to farm, we started having division of labor, which is just another way to say specialization of labor. You know, people were able to get different jobs besides farmer or hunter or gatherer, okay? And last of all, the impact of having this agricultural surplus led to a slow decline of that nomadic lifestyle that people lived before the Neolithic Revolution. So, you know, it's kind of obvious that if you're growing crops, you're going to need to stay in one place and take care of those crops. You can't move around all the time. And so that's why people stopped being nomadic and started being what we call sedentary. Sedentary means somebody who stays in one place. That's one of your vocab words. You ought to know that. All right, so next up is domestication. What is domestication? Well, we've talked about it a little bit. Domestication means adapting animals or sometimes plants to serve human needs. So for example, dogs. A long, long time ago, there were no dogs. All there were was wolves. Humans learned that wolves could be used to help us hunt. So over time, humans selected the wolves that were more friendly to humans, allowed them to breed and reproduce, and eventually, what used to be a wolf became a dog. Now this takes hundreds of years. It's not something that happens overnight. But humans were smart enough to figure out that domesticating animals and plants could make their lives easier. Now, let's talk about the importance of rivers. It's pretty obvious that rivers were important because pretty much all of these ancient civilizations that we've studied built their civilizations along a river. And if you took world geography, you should remember why most cities are built near rivers. Rivers are really good for providing rich soil. You got to have good soil if you want to farm. Rivers are also used to irrigate crops so they can bring water to your plants. They could provide more food and more drinking water. And they're also good for transportation. Most people use rivers as a sort of a natural highway, kind of like they did in ancient Egypt. The Nile River was kind of like their version of I-45. It was how most people got from point A to point B. Okay, so number 8, SCAAR. Hopefully everybody remembers what SCAAR means. If you don't remember, there's another video right here on my YouTube that you could watch which talks all about SCAAR. But real quick, I'm going to run through what each letter stands for. Okay? So the S in SCAAR stands for specialization of labor. Remember that specialization was something that happened as a result of the food surplus caused by the Neolithic Revolution. There was so much food that not everybody was needed to produce food anymore. So people were free to pursue other kinds of jobs besides just being a farmer or a hunter or gatherer. So that's when we started having the first laborers, artisans, and merchants, and scribes, all those specialized jobs that we've been talking about. The C in SCAAR stands for complex institutions. Remember that a complex institution is some kind of an organization that lasts for a long time and gives structure and meaning to a society. Great examples of complex institutions could be like governments and religions. And one important development that happened in religion and government at this time was the first written law code. Now, you may remember me talking about this in class, but the first written law code came from Mesopotamia. It was written down by a king called Hammurabi. And the whole idea was to write down the laws so that they could last for a long time. Hey, that sounds like a complex institution to me. So, next up is the A's in SCAAR. Remember, there's 2 A's in SCAAR. The first A stands for advanced cities. As people began to settle down, their towns and villages became bigger and more complex. Eventually, these towns and villages had walls around them. They started having big permanent buildings like ziggurats and pyramids. And over time, they became major centers of trade and interaction and exchange of culture. A great example of an advanced city could be like Mohenjo-Daro, which was located in the Indus Valley civilization. You might remember from the SCAAR video lesson, they actually had sewers and indoor toilets, they had public trash bins, and even planned out street grid patterns to make navigation around the city easier. The second A is advanced technology. You know, some of the things that they called advanced in the ancient world don't seem very advanced to us today, but when you really consider the fact that people had to figure out how to make these things all on their own without anybody showing them what to do, it really gives you an appreciation for how advanced these people really were. Now, you may remember from the SCAAR video that the perfect example of advanced technology that I used came from the Shang dynasty in China. You may remember that they were masters of crafting bronze. Bronze is a type of metal that's made from mixing copper and tin. Not an easy thing to do. Also, if you think about other types of technology, maybe not quite as sophisticated as bronze, but still impressive, were like the terraces that were used by the Chauvin in South America. Now, if you don't remember what a terrace is, it's that sort of staircase-looking carving that they do on the side of the mountain so that they can have flat areas for farming, and also it can shore up the side of the mountain and prevent erosion during rain. Pretty smart. Other types of advanced technology could come from mathematic understanding, and there's evidence of that in the pyramids and the ziggurats. So all over the ancient world, there were many examples of advanced technology. And last of all, R is for record keeping. Most advanced civilizations had some method of writing. That's what record keeping means. So, for example, you may remember that in Mesopotamia, they used a type of writing called cuneiform, where they pushed those little wedge-shaped symbols into soft clay tablets so that they could last for a long time. Other examples could be like the oracle bones and Chinese writing that was developed in the Shang dynasty, and of course hieroglyphics that were used by the Egyptians. Okay, so that's SCAAR: specialization, complex institutions, advanced cities, advanced technology, and record keeping. Those are all the characteristics of an advanced civilization that developed during the Neolithic Revolution. Okay, next up, location of river valley civilizations. Well, there's no really great way for me to just tell you this, so why don't you check out this map. Okay, so now you've seen the map, you really need to put that in your memory bank and remember where those civilizations are located at. It's going to be important for the test. Now let me just tell you a few facts about each one of those river valley civilizations, and I'll even throw in a little bit about one that wasn't on the map, the Chauvin. So the first one it lists is Mesopotamia. Okay? Now Mesopotamia is that part of the Fertile Crescent that we today call Iraq. Mesopotamia means the land between two rivers, and the rivers that we're talking about are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Now, one of the most important things that Mesopotamia gave us was the first written law code. Remember I said the first written law code was Hammurabi's code. Okay? Now, they also built ziggurats, which you may remember were those really big temples. They looked almost kind of like pyramids in ancient Egypt. They even traded with other civilizations like the Indus Valley civilization. Okay, sorry, I got stuck for a minute there. Okay, next up is Egypt. I think you probably know a little bit about ancient Egypt. They were also part of the Fertile Crescent, but they were in a different area. They were sort of in the southwestern part of the Fertile Crescent in North Africa near the Nile River. Remember, the Nile River is where they were located. One thing about the Egyptians was that they had a written language, like hieroglyphics. Hopefully everybody remembers those picture symbols, hieroglyphics. And they also had god kings called pharaohs. Remember that the pharaoh was not only the leader of the government, but he was also the leader of religion, which means that Egypt had a theocracy, a government that is run by religious leaders. They also built pyramids, so they had to have pretty advanced mathematical technology. And the people of Egypt depended very heavily on the Nile River, not only for farming, but also for transportation. Okay, next up is the Indus Valley civilization. The Indus Valley civilization was actually pretty lucky that they had some geographic advantages in their favor. Like, for example, the Himalaya mountains protected them from invasion from the north. They also had the Indian Ocean to the south, which sort of isolated them from other cultures, but made it easy for them to go out on boats and go trade if they wanted to, okay, which they did. They also had monsoons, which are powerful seasonal rains that made their land very fertile. And last of all, you might remember that the Indus Valley merchants had special seals, which were kind of like an ancient version of a receipt. And so that was a proof of purchase that you bought something from an Indus Valley merchant. Oh, and before I forget, of course, they also had indoor plumbing. No small thing, that's right. Indoor plumbing, indoor toilets in the Indus Valley. Okay, next up is the Shang dynasty. I know it looks like Shang, but Shang, they were the ones that were in China. You may remember that they were masters at creating bronze. They were also the first ones to develop China's written language, so that was a really special thing about the Shang dynasty. They practiced ancestor worship, and their traditions were able to stay intact for so long. As a matter of fact, some of them are still around today, because of the fact that China was isolated by geographic barriers, like, for example, the Himalaya mountains and the Talkil-Makan desert. Those barriers were very difficult for people to traverse, and that's why for a long time, few people knew about China, and it didn't really become a place that people knew about until the 19th century. So kind of an interesting place there, the Shang. And last of all, it asks about the Olmec on your test review, but I can tell you that there's really nothing about the Olmec on your test, so you're not going to need to know much about them. They were that ancient civilization that lived in Mexico. However, there will be some questions about the Chauvin, so you do need to know a bit about them. The Chauvin lived in South America in the Andes Mountains, which is not a very easy environment to live in. For one thing, if you live in the mountains, it's hard to farm. So remember I said that the Chauvin had to build terraces to do terrace farming. Sure why it cut off there, but we're back, no worries. Okay, so define a theocracy. Theocracy just means a government that's run by religious leaders. Think like Vatican City, where the Pope is in charge, or like ancient Egypt, where the Pharaoh was not only king, but a living god. All right, next up is Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi was one of those kings of Mesopotamia. Remember, we talked about him a little bit already. He was the first king that thought to write down his laws so that they would last longer than he would. And as a matter of fact, Hammurabi's Code is still around today. We can still read all the laws that he came up with. The reason why Hammurabi's Code was so important is because it was the first set of written laws in human history. And his laws unified the people of Mesopotamia under one single law code. That was pretty important. Okay, next up, barter. Really simple, look at your vocab. Remember that barter just means exchanging things without using money. That was what people did in ancient times before coins were invented or before there was any paper money. So for example, if I've got a bunch of apples and you've got some chickens, I could trade you 10 apples for 1 chicken, and that's called barter. That makes sense? Hopefully? Pretty easy. Okay. Next up, terrace farming. Not terrorist farming, terrace farming. Now I've already said this a few times, but let me show you a picture of what it looks like. Okay, as you can see, terrace farming is used in mountainous areas. It's a type of technology where you carve the mountain back into a staircase shape so you can have flat areas for building and for farming. All right, so next up is trade. How much of it happened? Probably a lot. We do have evidence of trade, like I said, from the people of the Indus Valley when they went to Mesopotamia. They left behind their seals. Remember I said that the seals were kind of like a form of a receipt. So that's evidence that there was trade going on in the ancient world. And it wasn't just the Indus Valley that traded with Mesopotamia. People from Mesopotamia traded with Egypt. Egypt traded with ancient Greece. So there was trade going on all over the ancient world. Okay, and man, I think that's it. We're at the end. Wow, that was a pretty fast test review. So remember that there's also the short answer prompt part down here. So if you're an on level, there are 2 possible prompts. You're going to have to answer one of them. So what I would suggest is prepare an answer for each one. That doesn't mean you need to write out the whole paragraph, but at least make a bulleted list or an outline of what you would want to say for each one of those essays. For K-level, there are 4 possible essay prompts, and you're going to be asked about 2 of them. So once again, K-level students, you don't need to write 4 essays, but you do need to write 4 short outlines so that you can at least organize your ideas and know what you want to say, regardless of which 2 I ask you on Wednesday. Okay guys, well now you got all the answers. I know that was really fast, but if you need to, you can go back and watch this video again. That's the beauty of the internet, right? Make sure that you study this, because honestly, writing this down one time and never looking at it again is not going to help you on the test. So the more you study this information, the more you quiz yourself, the more you go back and look at your notes, the better you're going to do. So let's start this year off right. Good luck on your first test, and I'll see you next time.